Hello everyone, and welcome to Fireside Story. Today we tell you the story of one of the most desperate moments in history. It is December 1776. The American Revolution is a breath away from extinction. George Washington's army, defeated, hungry, and frozen, crumbles day by day. The soldiers' contracts are about to expire, and most just want to go home. With the British ready for the coup de grace, Washington bets everything on one last desperate card. How could a nearly suicidal mission on Christmas Eve, against all odds, save a nation from collapse? Without further ado, we begin. The optimism that followed the signing of the Declaration of Independence was very short-lived. Reality arrived in the form of the largest expeditionary force Great Britain had ever sent. Its mission was not to negotiate. It was to crush the rebellion at its root and send a clear message. The first blow, in August 1776, was devastating. In the Battle of Long Island, Washington's inexperienced army was surrounded, crushed, and humiliated. It was not a simple defeat. It was a brutal lesson on the difference between militiamen and professional soldiers. According to chronicles, thousands of his men were captured. The rest barely managed to escape with their lives, abandoning New York to the British. From that point, everything went rapidly downhill. Morale, already fragile, shattered. The disaster continued into the autumn with the fall of Fort Washington. Losing that key fortress in Manhattan, along with its entire garrison and valuable supplies, was an almost mortal blow. Shortly after, its twin fort on the other side of the river was abandoned in haste. There was nothing left to defend. Thus began the Great Retreat across New Jersey. It was not a tactical maneuver. It was a desperate flight. We can easily imagine the scene. Ragged and demoralized rebels, closely pursued by the impeccable redcoats. Every town they passed through was a reminder of their failure, with the local population watching them with a mixture of pity and fear. Finally, the chase ended at the Delaware River. The Continentals crossed into Pennsylvania, making sure to take all available boats. The British general in command, William Howe, reached the bank and simply stopped. Why didn't he deliver the death blow? Pure confidence. He considered the rebellion finished. He decided to establish winter quarters for his troops. He would finish the job once the river froze. A minor bureaucratic detail. From the other bank, Washington watched impotently as his army bled dry. Howe's pause was not a reprieve. It was the equivalent of a cat playing with a mouse before the final blow. The army Washington had led to Pennsylvania was little more than a ghost. At the beginning of the year, it numbered almost 20,000 men. Now, in December, he barely had 2,400 soldiers left ready to fight. The rest had died, been captured, or simply had deserted. But the number of soldiers was not his only problem. Time was running against him in a much more literal way. The vast majority of his men had signed one-year enlistment contracts. Those contracts all expired on December 31st. A deadline that was approaching at a terrifying speed. We can visualize the scene without difficulty. A Continental soldier standing in the snow. His boots, if he ever had any, disintegrated weeks ago. Now he wraps his feet in rags, leaving small spots of blood on the frozen ground. His uniform is a mosaic of torn fabrics that barely protects him from the cutting wind. His stomach is empty, save for some miserable fire cake, a paste of flour and water cooked over the embers. It is not the diet of an army. It is that of a group of survivors. Morale was at rock bottom. They hadn't known a victory in months. With each passing day, more men decided they had had enough and went home. It was understandable. They fought for a freedom that seemed increasingly distant, while hunger and cold were an immediate reality. Washington knew it perfectly well. He needed a victory, and it had to be quick and impactful. Otherwise, with the new year, he would wake up as a general without soldiers. He would be a leader without a cause, and a rebel with a noose waiting for him. The American Revolution was one failure away from disappearing forever. In public, George Washington projected an unshakable calm. He was the image of the stoic leader the revolution needed not to collapse. But in private, that facade crumbled. His letters, written by candlelight, revealed an almost total despair. To his cousin he confessed bluntly, "I think the game is about to end." For the general, the cause was not in danger. It was practically dead. As Washington confronted the possibility of failure, a new and powerful voice began to circulate through the camp. It was not that of a general, nor that of a politician. It was that of Thomas Paine, a writer who fought not with a musket, but with words. And his words were ammunition for the soul. On December 19th, he published the first of a series of pamphlets titled The American Crisis. Its opening lines have become legendary. "These are the times that try men's souls." It went on to say that the summer soldier and the parlor patriot would cower in this crisis, but he who resisted it now would deserve the love and gratitude of all. A direct and brutally honest message. Washington ordered it to be read aloud to his troops. We can imagine those ragged men gathered around a campfire, listening to those words. They were not offered food or blankets, but they were given something almost as important, a purpose. It reminded them that their suffering was not in vain, that being a patriot in winter, when all seemed lost, was the greatest act of honor. This moral boost was crucial. It did not change snow into sun, but it did transform despair into a silent and resolute rage. Washington felt this change. It was no longer just about enduring until the end of the year. The defensive mindset, that of constant retreat, began to crack. The general began to look at the Delaware River in a different way. It was no longer just a barrier protecting him from the British. Now he saw it as a path towards the enemy. The idea of a simple withdrawal vanished. It was replaced by the germ of a bold and almost suicidal plan. The game was not over. Washington was about to deal a new hand. Washington's plan needed an objective, a target that was vulnerable, but whose capture would have an echo strong enough to change the course of the war. That place was Trenton, New Jersey, and its defenders were not British. They were Hessians. They are often called mercenaries, but the reality is a bit more complex. They were professional soldiers from various German states, mainly from Hesse-Kassel. Their princes rented them to the British Crown in very lucrative agreements. They did not fight for a cause, but for a contract. For them, war was a job, and they were very good at it. In Trenton, there were about 1,500 of these soldiers, veterans of tough European campaigns. They were divided into 3 elite regiments. They were the men of von Lossberg, von Kneifhausen, and those of the commander himself, Colonel Johann Rall. Without a doubt, they were a formidable force. Their discipline and the brutal use of the bayonet terrified the American militiamen, who often fled just at the sight of them. Commanding this force was Johann Rall, quite a peculiar character. He was a brave soldier with decades of experience and had earned his position through sheer effort. He loved music, good wine, and military parades. But his biggest flaw was boundless arrogance. After months of easy victories, he deeply disdained the rebels. For him, they were just farmers, a disorganized rabble incapable of facing real soldiers. This arrogance translated into a fatal error. Trenton was an isolated outpost, far from any quick British reinforcement. Several of his more cautious officers pleaded with him to build defenses and fortify the town. Rall flatly refused, mocking their caution. He is said to have responded with disdain, "Let them come, we will welcome them with the bayonet." He did not need earthworks. His valor was the only fortress Trenton needed. Thus, as Christmas approached, the Trenton garrison felt completely secure and confident. They were preparing to celebrate, oblivious to the desperate plan taking shape on the other side of the river. They did not know that their overconfidence was precisely the key piece in Washington's puzzle. The plan Washington designed was not a simple raid. It was a military operation of astonishing complexity. It was not a single attack, but three perfectly synchronized movements, like clockwork in the midst of a storm. He would personally lead the main strike. He would lead 2,400 of his best men, the heart of his army. Their mission was to cross the Delaware River at a point known as McConkey's Ferry, about 14 kilometers north of Trenton. Once on the other side, they would march to attack the city from two directions and crush the Hessians. Meanwhile, further south, two supporting forces would come into play. The first, under the command of Brigadier General James Ewing, had a crucial task. He was to cross directly opposite Trenton and seize the bridge over Assunpink Creek. This bridge was the only escape route. Ewing's objective was not so much to fight, but to close the cage. Even further south, Colonel John Cadwalader would lead a third force. His mission was to cross the river and launch a diversionary attack against another enemy garrison. The idea was to create chaos, draw the attention of the British, and prevent them from sending reinforcements to Trenton when the main assault began. Three distinct river crossings, three different commanders, three missions that had to be executed perfectly in the darkness of Christmas night and in the middle of a storm. There were no radios, no way to communicate if something went terribly wrong. The plan was brilliant on paper, but in practice, it was a house of cards built in the middle of a hurricane. Washington was not just betting on a victory. He was betting everything on a three-cushion shot that bordered on the impossible. The success of such a complex plan depended on a single factor, a factor Washington could not control: surprise. Luckily for him, Colonel Rall personally took it upon himself to guarantee it. And it wasn't for lack of warnings. Rall's arrogance was not just a pose. It became a total blindness to the accumulating signs of danger. Spies loyal to the Crown constantly reported troop movements on the other side of the river. Hessian patrols had had small skirmishes with rebels in the preceding days, but Rall dismissed every report with a wave of his hand. For him, they were just feints from a cowardly army. He did not believe that the farmers had the courage or capacity to launch a real coordinated attack. His confidence was absolute. On Christmas Eve, his disdain reached its peak. A farmer loyal to the British appeared at his headquarters. He carried a handwritten note from a spy. The message was desperate and clear. It said that the Americans were going to cross the river and attack Trenton that very night. It was a last-minute warning that could have changed history. But the farmer found Rall engrossed in a lively card game. He was in excellent spirits, celebrating with his officers amidst wine and music. Without giving it the slightest importance, the colonel took the note. He didn't even open it. He simply put it in his waistcoat pocket to read later. That small piece of paper contained the fate of his garrison. It remained there, forgotten, as the cards continued to fly across the table. That later would never come for him. Meanwhile, the rest of the garrison followed their commander's example. Christmas was a powerful reminder of their home in Germany. They celebrated it with enthusiasm and, above all, with much alcohol. Patrols relaxed. Vigilance decreased. In the minds of the Hessian soldiers, the only real enemy that night was the relentless cold of the storm. They expected no one else. The arrogance of one man and the nostalgia of his soldiers created the perfect storm. Washington didn't know it, but he had an unexpected ally on the other side of the river. An ally who was opening the gates of Trenton wide for him. A brilliant plan on paper is useless if you don't have the tools to execute it. And Washington's army faced a gigantic problem. How do you cross a frozen river with thousands of men and horses? You cannot simply build a bridge, and small fishing boats are useless against blocks of ice. The solution was a secret weapon hidden in plain sight. They were the Durham boats. They were not warships. They were the cargo trucks of the era. Flat-bottomed barges, enormous and sturdy, designed to transport iron and grain along the Delaware River. They were ugly, rugged, and perfect for the task. They could carry dozens of men or several tons of equipment. Here Washington's logistical genius is revealed. Weeks before the attack, he ordered his men to scour a vast stretch of the river. They were to confiscate all boats they found, especially the Durham boats. Then they hid them in coves and creeks on the Pennsylvania shore, away from the gaze of British spies. While the Hessians laughed at the rebels, they secretly prepared their fleet. But moving the men was only half the problem. Washington knew that to take Trenton, he needed firepower. And here enters Colonel Henry Knox, his chief of artillery, a former bookseller turned military logistics genius. Knox had the task of getting 18 field cannons across. Each one weighed almost a ton. They had to lower them down icy and slippery embankments in complete darkness. Then, load them onto the unstable boats alongside the horses that would drag them. A single error, a cannon lost in the river, and the attack could fail before it even began. The crossing operation was not just a gamble against the enemy. It was a brutal battle against physics, ice, and night. A logistical challenge that would have made even the most experienced general hesitate. On Christmas evening at McConkey's Ferry, there was no trace of celebration, only the murmur of exhausted men and the crunch of snow beneath their worn-out feet. The atmosphere was solemn, almost funereal, laden with the weight of a mission everyone knew was desperate. As the columns formed, the officers passed, whispering the night's password. It was not an inspiring motto, nor a patriotic battle cry. They were two words that perfectly defined their reality: victory or death. There was no third option. For these men, failure did not simply mean a retreat to safety. It meant capture, humiliation, and, most probably, the traitor's noose. Victory was not an abstract military objective. It was the only way to survive that night and see the dawn of a new day. Around 6 in the evening, with the last faint light of day fading, the embarkation began. The operation that had only existed on Washington's maps was set in motion, piece by piece. And at that very moment, nature decided to join the fray. What had been a bitter cold transformed into a violent northeaster storm. An icy wind that cut to the bone, sleet and gusts of snow began to lash them mercilessly. The Delaware River, their path to the enemy, had become a formidable adversary. The current dragged enormous, sharp chunks of ice. They crashed against the barges with the force of a battering ram. The sound of ice striking the wood was a constant reminder of how fragile their plan was. In that growing darkness and under the storm's punishment, controlled chaos began. The soldiers crowded into the boats. The artillerymen struggled to load the heavy cannons aboard, while the horses, terrified by the noise and movement, resisted at every step. The mission had just begun, but the first battle was already being fought. It was not against the Hessians. It was against a river that seemed determined to devour them. In the midst of that icy chaos, any normal infantry regiment would have failed. But Washington had an ace up his sleeve. They were the men of the 14th Continental Regiment, a group of soldiers who did not feel comfortable on dry land. Their commander was Colonel John Glover. His men came from the coastal towns of Massachusetts, especially Marblehead. They were not farmers. They were fishermen, whalers, and salty sea dogs. Tough men, accustomed to fighting Atlantic storms in much smaller boats. The Delaware, for them, was just another challenge. It was not the first time they had saved Washington's army from disaster. Months earlier, their naval expertise made possible the miraculous nighttime evacuation of Long Island. Without them, the war would have ended right there. Now history once again depended on their skilled hands and strong backs. We can imagine the scene. While the infantry soldiers huddled against the cold, Glover's sailors were in their element. They moved securely across the slippery decks of the heavy barges. With long iron-tipped poles, they pushed away ice floes that threatened to breach the hull. Their shouts echoed in the storm, guiding the barges through the river's treacherous currents. They knew how to read the water, even in absolute darkness. They felt the river's movement, as an animal senses danger. It was a skill not learned in a military training manual. It is learned by surviving at sea. This was not just a crossing operation. It was a naval choreography in complete darkness and in the middle of a storm. Any other regiment would have been lost. The cannons would be at the bottom of the river. Without the unique expertise of these sailors, Washington's bold plan would have drowned in the icy waters. Victory or death depended, first and foremost, on their astonishing ability to stay afloat. Washington's original plan was a model of military precision. He calculated that the river crossing would be complete by midnight. This would give them plenty of time to march the 14 kilometers to Trenton and launch a surprise attack in total darkness, long before dawn. But reality, as often happens, had other plans. The storm was not just a storm. It turned into a full-blown nor'easter, a brutal and violent meteorological phenomenon. The wind howled with incredible fury. The sleet transformed into freezing rain, soaking uniforms and freezing instantly, turning each soldier into a walking ice statue. The river became a deadly trap of ice floes that threatened to shatter the barges. Glover's sailors fought with superhuman skill, but even they couldn't speed up time. Each round trip was an odyssey. Lowering the cannons down the icy banks became a nightmare. The terrified horses refused to board. Washington's meticulous plan slowly dissolved into the icy chaos of the night. Midnight came and went. Most of the army was still waiting on the Pennsylvania shore. 1 in the morning, 2 in the morning. The operation, which was supposed to last a few hours, stretched on for over 9. Every minute that passed was a drop of hope freezing and falling to the ground. The last man did not set foot on the New Jersey shore until 3 in the morning. The army was not assembled and ready to march until 4 in the morning. They were 4 hours behind the most pessimistic schedule. The sun would rise in just a few hours. The main tactical advantage, the cloak of absolute darkness, had been lost. The attack would no longer be a night ambush. It would have to be in broad daylight. What was the point of continuing now? Any prudent general would have ordered a retreat. But Washington was not there to be prudent. He was there to win or die. While Washington's main army fought its own battle against the Delaware, the fate of the operation was being decided at 2 other points along the river. The master plan depended on all 3 attacks working like perfectly synchronized clockwork. But 2 of its most important gears were about to break. Further south, opposite Trenton itself, General Ewing and his men faced a nightmare. In that part of the river, the current was slower. This was not an advantage. It meant that the ice floes were larger and denser, forming an almost solid barrier from bank to bank. Ewing watched the scene helplessly. He could, with luck, get some of his infantry across. But his artillery, essential for blocking the Assunpink Bridge and closing the trap, had no chance of crossing. To send his men without cannons against a fortified garrison was suicide. He made the only logical decision and canceled his part of the attack. Even further south, Colonel Cadwalader encountered an identical wall of ice. His situation was just as desperate. In fact, some of his most determined men managed to set foot on the New Jersey bank. But like Ewing, he was unable to get his artillery across. Without cannon support, his diversionary force would be useless. With great frustration, he ordered the men who had crossed to return. His mission was also aborted. Washington's complex plan had completely fallen apart, and the worst of it was that he didn't know it. In his mind, two supporting forces were marching to cover his flanks and cut off the enemy's retreat. The reality was very different. As his 2,400 exhausted men advanced through the snow toward Trenton, they did so completely alone. The cage was not closed. The diversion would never happen. The operation was no longer a bold gamble. It had become, unbeknownst to anyone, a solitary march into a trap. A small aside, if you are enjoying this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. You will help us a lot to continue making more content like this. Truly, even though it's a simple click, it's the motivation we have to continue sharing history. Thank you. At 4 in the morning, with the army finally gathered on the New Jersey bank, the harsh reality became evident. They were hours behind schedule. Darkness, their greatest ally, was about to abandon them. The sun would soon rise. Any military manual would have advised retreat. Attacking during the day was suicide. His men were at their limit, frozen to the bone and exhausted by the crossing. But Washington knew that retreating now was the same as surrendering, not only in this battle, but in the entire war. There was no grand meeting of officers. There was no heated debate. The decision rested on his shoulders. According to those present, his determination was absolute. He was resolved to move forward, no matter what. The order was given. The army would march the 14 kilometers that separated them from Trenton. To maximize the speed and power of the attack, Washington divided his small force into two columns. The first, under the command of General Nathaniel Greene, would take the upper route. Washington and his staff would accompany him, along with Knox's artillery. The second column, led by General John Sullivan, would advance along a parallel road closer to the river. The two forces were to march separately in the storm and arrive on the outskirts of Trenton at precisely the same time to launch a coordinated attack. Yet another element in an already almost impossible equation. Thus began the march of desperation. A ghostly advance through the blizzard. The roads had turned into sheets of ice. The men slipped and fell constantly. The icy wind burned their faces and the freezing rain soaked them to the bone. Some soldiers reported to their officers that the moisture had rendered the powder in their muskets useless. The response was brutally simple. Use the bayonets, the town must be taken. In that silent and suffering column, every step was an act of pure will. They left behind a trail of bloody footprints in the virgin snow. The march to Trenton was not a simple walk. It was a 14-kilometer torture, in which every step was a personal victory against nature. The freezing, relentless rain seeped through their tattered clothes and froze instantly. Their uniforms became heavy suits of ice armor that stole what little warmth they had left and prevented them from moving with agility. Many men didn't even have coats to protect themselves. The wind howled like an invisible predator, searching for any exposed piece of skin to bite with the cold. But a soldier's greatest fear in that storm was not frostbite. It was the fear that their musket, their only long-range combat tool, would not work. A spark from a wet flint would not ignite wet gunpowder, and a useless musket was little more than a heavy club in the moment of truth. For this reason, we can imagine the men marching hunched over, protecting the firing mechanism of their weapons with their own bodies. They kept the muskets locked, covered under their jackets, or what remained of them. Their lives and the success of the mission depended on keeping that small amount of black powder dry. It was a silent and desperate struggle to preserve their only chance to truly fight. The most evident suffering was in their feet. Many of their boots had disintegrated weeks ago. Now, the mere blood-stained rags that wrapped their feet offered no real protection against the frozen, sharp ground. Every step left a crimson stain in the snow, creating a macabre trail that marked the army's advance. To see it must have been both horrifying and inspiring. It was tangible proof that their determination was stronger than their pain. But will, however strong, has physical limits. During that atrocious march, 2 Virginia soldiers, whose names have been lost to history, simply collapsed in the snow. They did not rise again. They froze to death, becoming the first casualties of the operation. The enemy still slept peacefully in Trenton, oblivious to everything. However, the word death from that night's password had already become terribly real. The same storm that had almost killed them during the march became their best weapon. The wind howled and snow fell so heavily that it muffled any sound. It made it impossible to see more than a few meters away. It provided perfect camouflage for an army that could no longer count on the darkness of night. Around 8 in the morning on December 26th, the first miracle of the day occurred. Despite the storm and the blind march, the 2 columns arrived at the outskirts of Trenton almost at the same instant. Greene's division from the north and Sullivan's from the west. The attack plan, which seemed shattered by the delays, fit back together like clockwork. At an outpost, a Hessian sentry sheltered from the storm. His main enemy at that moment was the cold, not rebels he believed defeated, and on the other side of the river. Suddenly, through the dense curtain of snow, he saw dark figures appear. Were they ghosts? For an instant, doubt paralyzed him. Then panic. The soldier cried out the alarm. His voice in German was barely heard above the blizzard. Der Feind, Heroes, Heroes. It was the desperate cry of a man who sees the impossible arriving. But it was already too late. The warning was drowned out by the roar of the first musket shots. There was no time to form a battle line. Washington's men, their weariness forgotten by adrenaline, charged. They burst into the town's main streets with a fury contained for months. The surprise was not partial. It was absolute. Henry Knox's artillerymen, acting with incredible speed, positioned their cannons at the heads of the town's 2 main streets. With those 2 arteries blocked, Trenton became a death trap. The Hessian soldiers, abruptly awakened from their Christmas slumber, emerged from their barracks half-dressed. They were met not by a skirmish, but by an entire army shouting and firing at them from the blizzard. The attack had begun. The roar of Knox's cannons was the most brutal alarm clock in history. Stationed at the head of King and Queen streets, their 18 artillery pieces completely dominated the town. The Hessian Christmas hangover was cured instantly. The artillerymen were not firing solid cannonballs. They used canister shot, essentially giant cans full of musket balls that, upon exiting the cannon, became a devastating shotgun blast. The effect was terrifying. The streets became deadly bowling alleys. The Hessian soldiers, stumbling out of their barracks, encountered a wall of metal and fire. Their legendary discipline evaporated in an instant. How could they form a battle line if they couldn't even cross the street? Panic replaced organization. While the cannons hammered the center of town, the American infantry advanced with lethal cunning. Instead of exposing themselves in formations, they used houses, walls, and fences as cover. They became invisible snipers, methodically firing at the disorganized groups of Hessians trying to understand what was happening. Amidst this initial chaos, one of the first charges occurred. Captain William Washington, the general's cousin, led a group of men to capture a Hessian cannon battery before they could respond. In the fierce exchange of fire, he received a gunshot wound to the hand. Seeing his captain fall, a young lieutenant from Virginia rushed to his side to help him. At that moment, a musket ball pierced his shoulder, severing an artery. That young and brave lieutenant, who nearly bled to death in the snow of Trenton, was named James Monroe. Yes, the future 5th President of the United States. The battle had barely begun and was already taking a heavy toll, even among those who would one day be legends. Suddenly awakened by the gunfire, Colonel Rall emerged from his quarters to find absolute chaos. The roar of Knox's cannons made the town tremble. His soldiers, disoriented and half-dressed, ran aimlessly through the streets. Rall understood that he was the only one who could impose order. With a courage no one could deny him, he managed to gather the men of his own regiment. He succeeded in forming them into an attack column in the midst of the crossfire. He even ordered his regiment's band to play military marches. It was a desperate attempt to restore courage to his troops through routine and music. His plan was audacious. He would try to retake the town with a bayonet charge. Mounted on his horse, he became the only point of reference for his men. He was a perfect target, but at that moment, his personal courage was undeniable. With sword drawn, he led his men in a counterattack down King Street. For an instant, it seemed that Hessian discipline might prevail, but the American riflemen, hidden in the houses, had too easy a target. Suddenly, 2 musket balls struck him almost simultaneously. The colonel reeled in his saddle. Then he fell heavily onto the blood-stained snow. The man who had mocked the farmers lay mortally wounded by them. The fall of their commander was a shockwave of panic. The counterattack stopped dead. The formation, held together only by his presence, disintegrated instantly. The soldiers, now leaderless, instinctively sought an exit. But there was none. Meanwhile, General Sullivan's units had completed the encirclement from the south. They blocked the Assunpink Bridge. That was the only possible escape route. The trap had closed. Trapped between Knox's cannons in front and Sullivan's infantry at their backs, the Hessian resistance completely collapsed. The battle had not ended, but its outcome was already decided. Everything had changed with the fall of a single man. With their escape routes blocked and their commander dying, panic seized the remaining Hessians. The regiments of von Lossberg and Rall, now without leadership, attempted one last, desperate maneuver. They tried to break through to the north, hoping to escape towards Princeton, but it was useless. They were forced to retreat to an apple orchard on the outskirts of the town. There, completely surrounded, they tried to form a last line of defense. But their situation was untenable. The storm had soaked their gunpowder. Most of their muskets would not fire. They could only watch helplessly as American musketry fire and grape shot from Knox's cannons tore them apart. The Hessian officers looked at one another. Courage was meaningless in the face of extermination. It was surrender or die without being able to defend themselves. The decision was unanimous and painful. White handkerchiefs tied to the muzzles of their muskets appeared. The firing ceased. Slowly, the officers advanced and offered their swords as a sign of surrender. It was all over. From the Sentinel's first shot to the last surrender, the Battle of Trenton had lasted approximately 45 minutes. A blink of an eye in military terms, but an eternity for those who fought in it. The final figures demonstrated the incredible magnitude of the victory. On the Hessian side, the balance was devastating. There were 22 dead, including Colonel Rall, and 83 seriously wounded. The most astonishing thing was that 896 soldiers were captured. And on the American side, combat casualties were almost nil. Only 4 men were wounded, including the future President James Monroe. The only American deaths were the 2 soldiers who froze during the march. In addition to the prisoners, Washington's forces captured crucial war booty. They seized 1,000 muskets and all the enemy artillery. They also confiscated tons of much-needed gunpowder, ammunition, and provisions. The attack had not only been a victory, it had been an almost perfect coup de main. The victory at Trenton was total, but the euphoria lasted barely a few minutes. Washington knew that celebrating in enemy territory was an invitation to disaster. The job was not over. Now came the most complicated part, returning home with the spoils and the prisoners. Managing almost 900 captives was a monumental challenge. These men were not a war trophy. They were a walking logistical problem, terrified and unarmed. They had to be organized and moved quickly. British reinforcements could appear at any moment and turn the victory into a massacre. Meanwhile, the American soldiers were at the absolute limit of their strength. They had been without sleep for over 24 hours, marching and fighting in the middle of a snowstorm. Their exhaustion was so profound that they could barely stand. But there was no time to rest. They had to drag the heavy captured cannons and ammunition boxes back to the river. The Delaware was still an inferno of ice and treacherous currents. The storm had not abated. Colonel Glover's sailors returned to their incredible task. They fought against the river again to bring everyone back. Each trip was slower and more dangerous than the last. The barges were overloaded with prisoners, exhausted soldiers, and the valuable spoils of war. The return crossing became the final test of their endurance. It was a silent and methodical effort. The men moved like automatons, driven only by discipline and the promise of a safe place on the other side. Every meter gained from the river was a small victory against physical collapse. Finally, well into the 26th, the last men stepped onto the Pennsylvania shore. They were soaked, frozen, and on the verge of collapsing. But they had done it. They had been to hell and back, and this time they brought victory with them. The news reached Philadelphia the next day. It didn't arrive as a formal announcement, but as a rumor that grew with each hour. A messenger, exhausted and covered in mud, had delivered an urgent dispatch to the Continental Congress. The city, headquarters of the revolution, held its breath. At first, skepticism was absolute. The idea of a victory seemed like a desperate fantasy. It was a story to boost morale in the darkest moment. People had heard too much bad news for months. This sounded too good to be true. But then it was confirmed. Washington had not only attacked, but had annihilated the Trenton garrison. When the number of almost 900 prisoners became known, disbelief turned into wild euphoria. The church bells, silent during the occupation of New Jersey, rang out furiously. People poured into the streets. Strangers embraced and tavern owners offered free drinks. It wasn't just the celebration of a military victory. It was the collective relief of a people who had seen themselves on the brink of the abyss and suddenly saw the light again. The psychological impact was profound. For months, the Americans had only known defeat. Trenton showed that they were not just a mob of rebellious farmers. They could face professional European soldiers and defeat them decisively. It was proof that their cause was viable. Washington's report to Congress was a model of restraint. It described the facts clearly and directly, without embellishment. But those facts were a thunderbolt. Congress, which had been debating whether to flee the city, regained its composure and determination. Confidence in their general was sky high. This change in attitude was crucial. Suddenly, political and financial support was revitalized. Men who hesitated to enlist saw a reason to believe. The victory at Trenton not only saved an army, it saved the credibility of the entire revolution. The game was not over. It had just begun anew. The victory at Trenton was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of one of the most brilliant lightning campaigns in military history, a period we know today as the 10 Crucial Days. Washington knew that momentum was everything. In a move that defied all logic, he ordered his army to cross the frozen river back into New Jersey. He was not retreating, he was doubling down. The British response was immediate and furious. They sent their best man, Lord Cornwallis, with an overwhelming force to crush the rebels once and for all. On January the 2nd, the two armies met again in Trenton. The Americans entrenched themselves in a solid defensive line behind Assunpink Creek. Cornwallis launched 3 frontal assaults against the American positions, and all 3 were repulsed with enormous casualties. Confident that he had Washington trapped, The British general postponed the coup de grace. "We'll bag the old fox in the morning," he told his officers. But the fox had one last trick. That night, Washington ordered the campfires to be left burning to deceive the enemy. While the British sentinels watched the flames, the entire Continental Army slipped away in the darkness. They performed a bold and silent night march, surrounding Cornwallis's flank. On the morning of January the 3rd, his army appeared where no one expected it. They were in the enemy's rear, near Princeton. There they encountered a smaller British garrison, which they defeated in a short but fierce battle. 3 decisive victories in barely 10 days. The impact was seismic. The British, humiliated and in shock, were forced to abandon almost all their posts in New Jersey. The revolution had not only survived, it had proven it could win. If I ask you to imagine the crossing of the Delaware River, it's almost certain you have a very specific image in your head. A general standing, defiant, at the bow of a boat navigating between blocks of ice. That image, etched in collective memory, is of Emanuel Leutze's famous painting, painted in 1851. It is a masterpiece, epic and inspiring, yet almost completely incorrect. Let's analyze the scene. To begin with, that glorious flag of stars and stripes waving in the wind did not yet exist in 1776. Its design would be approved months later. The boats are also a product of the artist's imagination. Instead of the robust Durham boats that were actually used, Leutze painted small rowboats that would have sunk in seconds in that icy river. And then there is George Washington himself. His pose is that of a legendary hero, but it is absurdly impractical. No commander in his right mind would stand like that in an unstable boat in the middle of a storm. He would have ended up taking a rather unadvisable dip. Even the landscape is false. Leutze, a German-American painter, used the Rhine River as a model, not the Delaware. Was Leutze a bad historian? Not at all. He was an artist with a very clear purpose. He painted the picture in Germany to inspire European liberal revolutionaries. He used the American Revolution as a symbol of the struggle for freedom against tyranny. He did not seek historical precision, but rather emotional and political impact. The painting shows us a glorious sunrise, a moment of romantic and clean glory. But the reality, as we have seen, was much dirtier and more desperate. It was a nocturnal, chaotic operation, carried out by half-naked men who left a trail of blood in the snow. Leutze's work does not capture the facts of that night, but it did forever capture the spirit of the legend. And sometimes, legend becomes more powerful than history itself. The victories of Trenton and Princeton were much more than military successes. It wasn't just about regaining control of New Jersey. What was regained was something intangible, but infinitely more valuable. The revolution, which hours before was agonizing, had breathed again, proving it wasn't dead. The most immediate effect was seen in his own men. On December the 31st, with contracts about to expire, Washington stood before his veterans. He pleaded with them to stay just 6 more weeks. He offered them a small extra payment from his own pocket. Before Trenton, they would have laughed. Now, driven by the pride of victory, most accepted. The Continental Army did not dissolve. The cause once again had a fist with which to strike. But the echo of those 10 crucial days crossed the Atlantic. The news resonated strongly in European courts, especially in Versailles. French diplomats didn't hear the story of a mere skirmish. They heard that an army of rebels had humiliated the feared Hessians and outwitted the best British force. The American cause ceased to look like a romantic revolt condemned to failure. Suddenly, it became a very interesting strategic investment for Great Britain's enemies. French aid, which would be decisive in winning the war, began to take shape in the snow of Trenton. And at the center of it all, their leader, George Washington went from being the general of retreats to becoming the living symbol of resistance. His audacity, his refusal to accept defeat when anyone else would have given up, cemented him forever as the undisputed leader of the Revolution. His legend was not forged in the comfortable salons of Philadelphia, but in the ice and blood of the Delaware. In the end, that night's password, victory or death, proved to be much more than a mere phrase. It was the very definition of the Revolution. There was no third option. Washington's desperate gamble on Christmas Eve didn't just win a battle. It saved the promise of a nation. It ensured that the Declaration of Independence would not become the epitaph of a dream, but the birth certificate of a country. And this concludes our journey into one of history's most decisive nights. Thank you for joining us in this account of Washington's incredible gamble that changed the destiny of a nation. We hope you have enjoyed this detailed analysis of the crossing of the Delaware. If you found the video interesting, we encourage you to give it a like, share it, and subscribe to the channel. This way, you won't miss our next adventures in the past. Your support is fundamental for us to continue telling these amazing stories. See you soon.